Okay, so this is inflation and deflation, and your learning target is that you should be able to explain what inflation and deflation are in relation to the money supply. Remember, the money supply is more than just currency. Focus questions are: what is inflation? How is inflation measured? What causes inflation? What is deflation? And then what causes deflation? Our key terms are inflation, demand side inflation, supply side inflation, velocity, simple quantity theory of money, hedge, and deflation. So what is inflation? So each good that's produced and sold in the economy, it has a price. We know this, right? So an average of all of these prices is what we call a price index or a price level. Now inflation is an increase in that price level or on the average level of prices. So something has caused the price to go up. So how do we measure inflation? So if the price level increases from one year to the next, the economy is experiencing what's called inflation. And I just want to interrupt myself here and say that the Federal Reserve allows for inflation to increase on a year-by-year factor by 2%. If it's greater than 2%, the Federal Reserve will step in. If it's under 2%, they'll do nothing. So one way of determining inflation is to look at changes in the consumer price index. So that CPI, that market basket of goods that we talked about, the Federal Reserve uses this. So again, this is how you factor in inflation. Okay. So between 1960 and 2010, the United States experienced really wide fluctuations of inflation. And approximately what was the highest rate during those years? So if you look at this, right, so it's 1960, so we're going to start here. And you can see in 1980 it was the highest, and it was between 10 and 15%, so 12, 13%. And approximately what was the lowest? So that would be in I think that's 2007, and it's in the negatives. It's not even a percent, but there's a reason for that, and this is the Great Recession, right? So that's why when in the last presentation I talked about you want to be careful about what year you pick for your base year. This would be one of the reasons why. So you can look at inflation from in the United States from say 1920 to 2017, and here you go. So this is right around the World War I is being fought by the United States, right? And then this is the Great Depression begins. So you can see this is the cumulative price change in the United States. It's 1,123.93%. But the average inflation rate is 2.62%. When you take all of these and you factor them in, when you flatten the curve, it's 2.62%. But the price difference is if something was $100 in 1920, it's going to be over $1,000 today. Okay, so the CPI in 1920 was at 20, and the CPI in 2017 was at 244.786. So inflation is a big deal. So if you look at these two, this is the average CPI, and then this is the percentage change in the average CPI. They don't match up. Okay. So that's why we look at both things, not just the CPI, but the percentage change as well. So the CPI rose only slightly during the period from 1913 to 1968, but then it begins to increase substantially after that date. And one way to interpret that graph is an indicator of what happens to the value of the dollar over time. So when the CPI rises, that simply means that the dollar buys less than it used to buy. So it has less value, right? So as the CPI rises, the value of the dollar falls. So it is possible for a nation to reach a critical level of inflation, which is called hyperinflation. It's out of control inflation. This is a video you can watch on Germany. This is Germany before it becomes Nazi Germany, and hyperinflation definitely had something to do with the rise of the fascists in Germany. Now, Germany is not the only country that has had hyperinflation. Here's a list of countries that have had hyperinflation and when, and you can see, yes, the United States has experienced hyperinflation as well, and that was during 1861 to 65, which if you know your history, that would be the Civil War, okay? But it happens, all right? Here's a Nicaraguan $200,000 bill. So it's crazy. These are stacks of money that kids are playing with in Germany. They were burning this stuff for fuel at one point. Demand side versus supply side inflation, not complex to understand at all. One is based on it's the demand side, and one is based on the supply side. And what you're gonna do is, if it's in this case it's demand side, that's what causes the shift for the demand. Supply stays the same, or the supply side. And you guys should remember how to do the graphing because you guys were fine on that on chapters 4, 5, and 6. So demand side inflation, it occurs when there's an increase in the price level that originates on the demand side of the economy. Okay, so it's by us. And it's caused by an increase in the money supply, which is going to cause inflation. So supply side inflation occurs when there's an increase in the price level that originates on the supply side, like the cost of making something goes up or down. So there's this thing that economists use. It's called the simple quantity theory of money. And the simple quantity theory of money, it presents a clear picture of what causes inflation because something has to cause it. And so to understand this theory, you need to understand velocity and the exchange equation. So what velocity is in economics is it's the average number of times that a dollar is spent to buy final goods and services in a single year. So the equation for this, or the exchange equation is M times V equals P times Q. So it's the money supply, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve, times velocity. And then that has to equal price times the quantity of output. Okay, and these have to equal each other. They can't not equal each other. So M times V equals P times Q. So you've got M of 500 and a velocity of 2. So 500 times 2 is 1,000. You've got $10 per $10 price rather, and then you've got 100 quantities. So 500 times 2 is 1,000. 10 times 100 is 1,000. So this equals to what it should be. Okay. Now the simple quantity theory of money, it predicts that changes in the price level will be strictly proportional to the changes in the money supply. So according to this theory, if the money supply were to double, so it went from $500 to $1,000, that would mean that the price level will double as well. So that what used to be 10, remember how when I'm getting these numbers is from here, okay? So it goes from 10 to $20, assuming that the velocity and the quantity of output remain constant. So if this goes from 500 to 1,000, this should go from 10 to 20 because they should be proportional because it's supposed to equal each other. But in reality, the change is not perfectly proportional. So 100% increase in the money supply, it could result in a 50% increase in the price level. Because in the real world, the greater the change in the money supply, the greater the change in price. And there's lots of reasons for this. Perception of the buyer, perception of the supplier, and they can artificially change. And we worked with supply and demand, and we saw shifters. So the simple quantity theory, being a mathematical formula, shows the change being instantaneous. But in reality, there's lag. So the effects of inflation. So inflation increases the amount that people have to spend on a particular good or service. And it can affect people that live on fixed incomes, like people who live in poverty or people who are old and have like Social Security benefits, people who are saving, and then partners in contracts. You make a contract with somebody for something, and then the price doubles, and that's not in your contract. That means you're losing a ton of money, 50%. Okay. So inflation in individuals on fixed income. So inflation, it reduces their buying power. So examples of this are people on Social Security, people who are receiving investment proceeds, or people who are poor. Inflation in savers. So if the inflation rate is actually higher than the interest rate that you're earning on your savings, you can actually lose money by keeping it in the bank. So like, for example, if you're receiving 2% interest on your money and then inflation goes up to 3%, you're actually losing 1% of the value of your money by keeping it in the bank. Not a good idea. And then you have inflation in past decisions. And what I mean by past decisions is like you make a contract. Contracts generally are for a 1-year term. They can be longer or they can be for fewer, but you're making a contract up based on the price of things at the time of the contract. You don't really know what the price of something is going to be in, the next day, let alone 6 months. But you do the best that you can to make a prediction, and sometimes inflation will hurt you bad. Then you have inflation and hedging against inflation. So to hedge means that you try to avoid or at least lessen the loss. And how you do this is you have some sort of counterbalancing action. So what's going on here is people are trying to figure out like what's the best protection against the harm of inflation with their investments. So what they do is instead of investing in only one thing, they diversify their portfolio. That's what it's called. They'll have some of their wealth in gold or precious metals or gems, real estate, things like art, because remember we had vertical supply, so that means that the value of it, the supply will never increase, but the value will increase or decrease. Because it's unique, it should increase. So what is deflation? Well, it's the opposite of inflation. So deflation is a decrease in the price level or the average level of prices. And I know that sounds like it's a great thing because that means that your dollar will buy more, but that's not actually a good thing. And I'll explain it in a second. So deflation, how you figure out the deflation rate is you take the CPI of the latter year, subtract it from the CPI of the earlier, divide that by the CPI of the earlier year, then multiply by 100. And you've already seen this formula before when we talked about CPI. In this case, you can use the same formula to figure out deflation rate. Meaning, if you use this and you get a negative number, that's deflation. If it's a positive number, it's inflation. Not hard to understand. So demand side deflation versus supply side deflation. It's like inflation. Deflation can result from changes in price or change in supply. So for example, if aggregate demand decreases and aggregate supply stays where it was, or doesn't change, then deflation is going to occur. Now, eventually, though, supply will meet where demand is. Remember, supply and demand will always shift towards the equilibrium. It takes time. The simple quantity theory of money and deflation. So the simple quantity theory of money, it can be used to explain deflation just as it was used to explain inflation. So according to this theory, if the money deposit goes from $1,000 to $500, then the price should go from $20 to half of that, which is 10. Okay, so it's just the opposite of what we talked about with inflation. So there's some major effects, though, of deflation. First is that when prices fall, they do not fall at the same time. So it's not as if if there was a 5% deflation in the economy, it's not 100% of the economy that's affected by this. It's going to happen in stages. It can happen in consumer prices, and then from there it can affect supply side, government, all these other things. So it takes time. There's always a lag factor. And the reason why is because suppliers make things in anticipation that you and I are going to buy them. They don't normally make things too far in advance because of things like inflation and deflation, because you want to have some control. We have what's called just-in-time manufacturing or supply, which means that the stuff that we're going to be starting to buy right now for the summer, those things were just produced, say, from January on. They didn't make them in last June because of things like this, because of inflation or deflation. And it could affect their ability to make a profit. And then during times of deflation, on the supply side of things, because prices fall, meaning that the supplier is getting less for what they produced, this often leads to suppliers not being able to continue to supply things at the same rate because they'd actually be losing money. So what do? They either go out of business or they lay off their workers. Well, if you lay off your workers, right, that means you have fewer people buying your products. And if you have fewer people buying your products and you're making less of the products, then the price will shift back to what the prior equilibrium price was. Okay, so that's that. All right, thanks, guys.